This is the second lesson of chapter 6, where we're going to investigate the concept of free energy and how one way that scientists can model free energy is through the equation shown here, which is the change in Gibbs free energy, or delta G. So when you're calculating the change of something, you subtract the initial state from the final state. So delta G equals G final state minus G initial state. So we would need to have some information about the energy of that system before and after an energy transformation. Perhaps you remember learning about this concept in chemistry. So this is another example of where chemistry and biology intersect. But again, we'll try to focus on why this is most relevant to biology. So when you're not going to actually have to calculate this. I just want you to understand the theory and the concepts of what it means to have a delta G that's negative or less than 0, and what it means to have a delta G that's positive in value or greater than 0. So there's some terminology that we're going to use to relate to those concepts. If delta G is less than 0, then that's a spontaneous exergonic reaction. Now, a spontaneous reaction can be harnessed to perform work. So this is a relevant outcome for a biological system where energy is needed to get something done. That's the source of energy from that spontaneous reaction. Spontaneous means that it will occur without any energy input. It occurs just spontaneously, kind of not really at random, but if that helps you remember, it just happens. But it releases energy, and that's where the term exergonic comes in. That means energy is being released, and again, that's available to do work. In contrast, if delta G is greater than 0, then that's a non-spontaneous reaction. It does not just happen because it needs a source of energy input. And so endergonic, ender means going into something, so endergonic means there needs to be energy going in to fuel that reaction. When we get to the next chapters in the class on photosynthesis and cell respiration, I'll revisit these concepts, but I'll mention here why. Photosynthesis is an endergonic reaction. It requires an energy input for organisms to convert inorganic carbon into organic carbon to make food. That energy source is the sun, solar energy. While cellular respiration is an exergonic process because it releases energy, it creates ATP, a source of potential energy that can be used to perform work. So this is why these concepts are important, and you'll hear these terms used again throughout other lessons in the class. So that's why this chapter is so important, to just kind of establish some basic concepts and terminology that we'll see again. Okay, now we can also look at a graphical representation of delta G, or free energy change of a reaction, through a graph. Now this graph is loaded with a lot of information, including a topic of enzymes, which we'll get to in a different video. So for now, if you could try to just ignore the red line and the red text, and just focus on the black line or black curve that's reflected here. So take a moment to just orient yourself with this graph, what's being shown. Read the X and Y axes. And you always read a graph unless it shows otherwise from left to right. So you would start here at the left of the black curve, go up, it's like a roller coaster ride, and then down. And so, okay. So what do we have here? We have on the x-axis progress of the reaction, time. This is basically, you read it from left to right, and that's what happens over the course of time. And on the y-axis is free energy, or G, Gibbs free energy. So whenever reading a graph like this, showing a progressive reaction, you're starting with the reactants and ending with the products. So what we can say here about this reaction is that the free energy associated with the reactants, or G initial from the free energy equation, GI, is a higher value than the free energy associated with the products, or GF. So even though there's no numbers on the y-axis here, you could theoretically just predict what delta G would be if it's greater than 0 or less than 0, or maybe equal to 0, if that's a thing, I'm not sure. So let me just sketch that out here. Delta G equals G final minus G initial. Trying to write it out because I don't think I can do superscripts with the text box. All right. You can pick random numbers if you like, that makes sense, or you can just look at the value based on big and small. GF is smaller than GI. So if you have a small number subtracted from a big number, you're going to get a negative number, right? So that's all we need to say here. Delta G is going to be equal to a negative number, or we could just say it's less than 0. So this reaction modeled here with the black curve, if delta G is less than 0, contemplate for a moment, is that going to be spontaneous or non-spontaneous? Is it going to be exergonic or endergonic? What do you think? Well, going back to the previous slide, if you're not sure, delta G, if it's less than 0, is a spontaneous exergonic reaction. So that's what we can say about this graph. It's a spontaneous exergonic reaction. There's still energy available after this reaction to do work in the system where this is taking place. Okay, now we'll revisit this graph again in another lesson about enzymes, because we'll see how the enzyme affects delta G, if at all, and what other aspects of a reaction are affected by an enzyme. So let's take this reaction to the next step. We have this exergonic reaction, giving energy still available to do work. What kind of work can be done with the energy that's available from this reaction? Well, a cell can do 3 main types of work: chemical work, transportation, or mechanical work. Now, in this class, we will talk about chemical work, which again would be like through photosynthesis and through chemical reactions that take place within an organism. Transport would be things like active transport across the cell membrane, where we needed some ATP, some energy, to be able to transport a molecule against its concentration gradient. Mechanical would be like physical motion, like a paramecium swimming through the water, beating its cilia to move. That requires work. And energy then would be needed to fuel that process. So to do work, these 3 types of work, a cell uses energy coupling. There is a recycling of ATP and ADP in a cell. ATP, which is the molecule that holds the potential energy to do work, is through hydrolysis. So you see water coming in here, hydrolyzed, and through that reaction, anabolic processes can occur. So these are processes that break down larger molecules into, no, I'm sorry, that's the one where they build them up. Anabolic means building up, taking smaller components and building larger ones. So those are endergonic, energy-consuming processes. So there needs to be energy to fuel that in the form of the ATP. Okay, now after ATP is hydrolyzed or basically used to fuel those cellular reactions, then you're left with ADP and inorganic phosphorus. So those are the components that then can be recombined to recreate ATP. Let's dig a little bit deeper into what is ATP, what is ADP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and this is the molecular structure of ATP. So you can see the 3 phosphate groups here attached to an adenine, a nitrogenous base, and a ribose sugar. This is the ribose sugar, and here on the far right is the adenine. Think of ATP like a fully charged battery. It has the full amount of potential energy to do work. And that energy is stored between the bonds of the phosphate groups, which can be broken through hydrolysis. So when water is added, it breaks the last phosphate group. The terminal phosphate bond is broken, and energy is then released, available to do work. The phosphate group might be added to another molecule, but it can be then later released and brought back. And so that's where we see the recycling of ATP from ADP. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. So it has only 2 phosphate groups, but still you have the adenine and the ribose sugar. And think of ADP like a non-fully charged battery. It's like half charged, but you can recharge it if you have the right device, right? You can buy rechargeable batteries. So if the inorganic phosphate group is added back to ADP, then we have ATP again available to do work. So it's actually the movement of the phosphate group. The way that the ATP drives the endergonic reactions is through phosphorylation. So that phosphate group can be added to other molecules to provide that energy. We'll see how this relates to specific reactions as we get into other topics in the class. So the main thing here to take away today from this lesson is the concept of delta G, the types of reactions, and also the renewable nature of ATP and what role that plays in reactions that require energy. Okay, so we have one more lesson coming up about enzymes. Stay tuned for that next.